Magical melding, and promises were kept. Two souls welding, together they accept. One glorious truth settled into their souls. There's nothing to lose in accepting their roles.
Deity gives every Estolian the exact trials and tribulations that they need to refine the purity of their soul and bring them the greatest blessings in their time. Ninth postulate of inner peace. K. Darrow.
While they walked, he pointed out several items of interest, telling her some of the history of the building. When they got to her room, he escorted her inside.
Thank you, Gregorio,
she said softly. His expression was serious. He brushed her hair back away from her face, his hand warm against her skin. He began, breaking off as if he did not know what he really wanted to say. He stepped closer to her, his hand sliding into her hair.
Wraith.
He whispered her name. The feel of his lips on hers kick-started her heart. She had dreamed of him one day coming to care for her, but for so long she had been telling herself to forget the fantasy. She could not believe it was coming true. When he pulled back slightly, she asked,
Gregorio?
No other woman has ever incited my imagination, Wraith.
He said, his voice barely above a whisper.
I could not imagine what it was like to wish to lose one's soul before this day.
The feel of his warm body against her own, his large hands cupping the back of her head, the electric thrill of reaction between his skin and hers all contributed to a sense of timelessness. He pulled her closer still and his lips were on hers again, his tongue brushing her bottom lip until her lips parted. The feel of his arousal pressed against her finally penetrated the haze of desire rushing through her body. She pulled back slightly and saw they had somehow gone from the door to the side of her bed. In addition, she had a vague memory of unbuttoning his shirt and caressing his chest. She had to fight against her desire to experience everything there was to know about this man.
Gregorio,
she said again.
Wraith.
He said.
I cannot just say goodnight and leave you.
His hands dropped a little lower than her waist, instead spanning her hips, pulling them tight against his. She did not want him to go. With his shirt open in front of her, she pushed the fabric aside and leaned towards him, kissing his chest, tasting his skin, smelling his personal scent. Her attention was so centered on getting to know his body and taste, she did not notice when he unzipped her dress. It was only as it slithered off her body, leaving her standing in only her camisole top and matching undergarments, that she realized what was happening. She looked up at him and saw the glaze of desire on his face.
I must.
He broke off, looking down at her with a strange expression. He looked almost tortured as his eyes met hers and his hand came up to cup one breast through the fabric of her camisole. She knew she should stop this. He had declared his intention to only be intimate with his wife. A part of her felt like she was going to force his hand if she allowed him to continue. She pushed his shirt off his shoulders and felt it fall on her feet.
Wraith.
He whispered again.
You are so beautiful.
She lifted her face to him and was rewarded when his lips covered hers. Desire rippled through her body. When they came up for air, he was pulling her camisole off her upper body, and she was unbuckling his belt. She pushed his pants down over his hips, and he bent towards her, cupping one breast, while he teased the other with his mouth. She gripped his shoulders hard in response to the way he was inflaming her senses. She felt as if there was some power she possessed that she had never accessed before. He had declared his purity to be as important to him as hers was to her, but the desire to experience all that he was more important to her, mattered more to her than any arbitrary vow of celibacy either may have made. He ran his hands over her naked back, following the curve of her spine until he reached the silk and lace of her undergarments. She mimicked his actions, running her hands over his shoulders, back, spine, until she was disappointed by the feel of fabric in the way of her exploration. She pushed her hands beneath them. It was not long before the heat at her core demanded the only way to appease her need was by removing the last of their clothing. She pushed his briefs down his legs, feeling the rough hair of his thighs. He pulled her back to her feet and then pushed her undergarments off with more haste. She stepped out of the scrap of lace, and looked at him, seeing the entire man, the proud jut of his erection and the sensuality in every line of his body. Her breathing came in shallow, short gasps as she anticipated his possession. She backed up to the bed behind her and turned away from him to push the covers back. When she straightened up, he was just behind her. His hands came around her, holding her breasts, rubbing over the rigid tips, his hips pressing against her, as his mouth nibbled on her ear. She tilted her head back, feeling the overpowering rush of sensation sparking each nerve ending into quivering life. She turned around and looked at him. Her eyes met his as she reached for and touched the rigidity of his arousal, caressing him, accepting and wanting the merging of flesh. He kissed her again. They moved as one onto the bed. When he pushed one of his legs between hers, she realized that she had to be certain he wanted this as much as she did.
Gregorio?
She extended the syllables of his name, wanting to caress every part of his body with the same passion as she said his name.
I want you to make love to me. Possess me. But only if this is what you really want.
He cupped her intimately and only iron willpower enabled her to finish speaking.
Wraith.
He said, opening his eyes to look down at her. She could see he was as sharp as ever, and he was definitive when he said to her,
This is what I want, to possess and be possessed equally.
He slid both legs between hers, his body pressing up against her as he kissed her again. He pulled his head back slightly so he could look into her eyes while their bodies merged. She wanted this man to love her, even as he possessed her, filling her heart, soul, and body with all he had to give her. She felt the strength of their union, enjoying and reveling in the sense of his body within her own, bringing her to a feeling of pleasure and joy beyond anything she ever imagined was possible. She did not know if their mutual dance lasted minutes or hours, but when pleasure rolled in waves of warmth through them both, he gasped her name. She felt as if every beat of his heart was a pulse within her own body.
Gregorio?
To Wraith, his name felt like the sound of water rushing over the pebbles in a stream.
Wraith.
He looked at her and kissed her again before reluctantly moving away from her. She felt a sense of loss when his body slipped from hers. He then gathered her close, pulling the covers over them. He was crying. She felt tearful, but for her, it was the unspeakable joy of their connection that made her want to cry. She hoped his tears were not for the loss of virtue. She knew with a sure sense that, even if this was the only time she would ever know this man in this way, she could not regret the mind-blowing experience they had just shared. But she hoped with every part of her body that she would not be deprived of knowing this again.
That was,
He said softly, his arms crushing her to him.
the most incredible experience of my life, Wraith.
He kissed her again.
The memory will always be exquisite.
He took a deep breath.
I'm not sure we can't surpass it.
She said, hoping to hear he wanted more than the one experience. He pulled back slightly and grinned down at her.
I think, Wraith, you have just issued me a challenge I cannot ignore. We should make plans to practice until we can surpass this experience. I know I will never be able to touch another woman in my life.
His eyes met hers steadily, when he asked.
Make your life with me, Wraith. Promise to be with me forever.
She did not wish to be apart from this man.
You mean,
Knit your life permanently to mine. Marry me. Keep my soul safe. Have our children.
She touched his face, running her fingertips over the planes and curves.
do you mean it?
Oh yes, Wraith, I would not survive if you left me now.
Gregorio, I want to be with you, be yours, have you be mine for life and on into eternity if we can swing it.
My father knew you were the right one for me.
He said.
He might pop in here.
Tonight?
She asked, feeling her face flood with color.
An Estolian tradition peculiar, I know.
He kissed her briefly before climbing out of the bed. Smiling at her, he moved to a chest at the foot of her bed. Opening it, he pulled out a robe and shrugged into it, before handing her a nightgown. She put the garment on, and then looked at the untidy scattering of clothing and shoes. He helped her pick up the scattered apparel. After everything was tidy, he pulled her back into his arms, kissing her, pulling her body tight up against his. They were so involved with one another it was almost a shock when the sound of a throat being cleared intruded on their solitude. She pulled away from Gregorio and looked towards the door, blushing when 3 men entered the room, the king, the former king, and Gregorio's father. Gregorio grinned at the 3 men, pulling her up against his body, both of his hands settling onto her abdomen.
Gregorio,
Theo said,
as the firstborn son of the keeper, do you have anything to say?
I, Gregorio Mortimer Zakarian, have given my soul into the keeping of Wraith Michelle Verone.
Theo nodded and turned his attention to Wraith. He was projecting 2 disparate emotions, cold, implacable duty, and warm approval. She waited to hear what he had to say.
Wraith Michelle Verone, did you willingly take my son's soul into your keeping?
He asked her. Guessing they meant something to do with either taking his virginity or his taking hers, she nodded.
I did.
Will you keep his soul safe the entirety of your life?
He asked. She looked up at Gregorio, feeling a sense of both adventure and homecoming.
Gregorio's soul will be safe with me, always.
Hesitation, indecision, brought doubts and unease. Unable to see, to envision the aura his soul would seize. One glorious truth settled into their souls. There's nothing to